Hello, 531 class. Dr. Hastings here. Hope everybody had a nice weekend. I'm going to do a brief video narrative relative to the content I placed in the Canvas course for week 13. And I have two sets of slides there, one that addresses legal aspects and one that addresses scholarship and service per roles for faculty. Now, both of these are biased towards academia, so I want to be transparent about that. But we'll try to allude to healthcare agencies. I think you'll probably be better able to fill in the gaps on that in the DQ for the week. But moving forward, all right, so we're talking about in these two decks and for this week, chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, the language for the Smith book is clearly biased towards academia again. It has a lot of legalese associated with it. I'm going to focus more on the practical, but consider roles and legal responsibilities, how academic faculty may appear similar to mentors and preceptors used at healthcare agencies. I think that matters, and that might help. That might be elaborated upon the DQ. Remember that a practitioner, a nurse who is credentialed, performing in a teaching capacity anywhere in academia or in a hospital, is held accountable to at least the institutional standards, but to at least an implied legal sense of upholding and being accountable for standards set forth, like in the syllabus, and then for acting prudently in a classroom to provide a positive, healthy learning environment. So the ultimate standard, of course, from a professional legal perspective, just like for clinicians, is what would the prudent person do, what would the prudent teacher do in a given situation, what would the prudent educator do in a certain situation, which is just analogous to what a prudent nurse may do in terms of providing patient care. Okay, so in Chapter 5 first, I have a few slides towards the end relative to Chapter 6, but Chapter 5 of Smith relates to a few relevant themes, FERPA being one. That's the analogy to HIPAA, patient HIPAA, as in the confidentiality now for students. This is really written relative to student access for educational records and the obligation relative to those records, realizing students can access their academic records at any time. And some of you may know that parents don't have access, per se, unless students give permission. That's a such thing, certainly for traditional students, that might be relevant. So, okay. So in the Smith book, there's one relevant situation I think that we all should be mindful of in a practical sense: sexual harassment, which is a popular theme these days, right? The quid pro quo conditions, if conditions for employment even implied, involve an expectation of faculty member or educator to submit to something. So that's you against some kind of other colleague, administrator, what have you, department head. That clearly is unhealthy. It's a hostile environment. And of course, we would frame the same thing for even a teaching environment with us versus students. But the theme here is focused for the moment on you being in an academic culture and having colleagues that include tiers of administrators above you. So the whole theme about intimidation or unwelcome sexual behavior certainly is unacceptable. But two things come out with this. Good boundaries with other colleagues, but I frame it here, good boundaries with students, because I think it is relevant. You know, these kind of legal cases can be linked to a classroom type of setting. So themes of power, themes of submission, things like that. Be mindful of any relationship in which somebody who's under you could be in a position in which you have some level of power, and how do you project that upon them. I think that's a key consideration. So, okay. All right. So still in Chapter 5, ethics just in general. Important considerations for a working culture is, again, for you to support. The prudent educator would support when it's conducive for students to learn in, for faculty to teach in. Faculty are responsible then also for establishing collegial relationships, like with peers. And aside from the theme that we just had in terms of an unhealthy dynamic, such as that associated with harassment, conflicts of interest, to avoid those kind of things. You know, not be in or not allow yourself to be in a position of power, say on a committee, where you might determine some kind of outcome that's important for a colleague of yours. So whether that's approval for research project on an IRB committee, or maybe if you're on the tenure and promotion committee and a colleague is up for that. And this is something that you know, in more than just a passing relationship with you, a friendly relationship with, that could be a problem. So thinking about those kind of things. We're focused here more, I'm focused more on the faculty-student relationship, but understand these collegial things could happen, could create some issues and affect them too. Remember, for us, in that faculty-student relationship, the syllabus, the binding contract, and supports an ethical posture grounding that relationship. There are a few things that Smith referred to. I like the theme on negligence theory. Could come up. The case on Nova Southeast on page 189-90 associated with practicum sites. Very interesting. Contract theory, probably more compelling. A syllabus is a contract. A student handbook is a contract. So within those things, we're talking about, the way in which accountability for a class and the students being accountable then to their syllabus is important. However, there are other things that are murkier in contract theory in an academic setting. Certainly the idea of protection, becomes a gray area, So there's certainly class policies in the way class must conduct itself. Certainly with clinical, we know that for sure. And instructors can be held accountable if we deviate from that. So from what would be a healthy learning environment. This sounds very nursing ethicsy at one level, moving towards that professional negligence type of theme. In healthcare agencies, clearly not my domain, but I even got the impression when I talked to some of the leaders of the education departments regionally that there is some level of accountability, again, for new orientees and even for seasoned nurses that are in classes for annuals, to which, there's a certain implicit standard for acting prudently. So we don't see that too often. Usually it's only if there's a gross departure, and can lead to some kind of harm in the training of a new orientee in particular, or a seasoned nurse, coming back maybe for a very complex skill set. But that's pretty rare, we'll just say in general. The unfortunate assumption of us versus them in the classroom becomes divisive. Students and their anxiety being high towards the end of the semester, so we're talking academia now, can be problematic. So let's just say there's a range of factors that contribute to student conflict with students per se, but the perception of unequal or unfair treatment, particularly challenging. And the best thing to do, have a sit down, have a discussion. Don't let necessarily email be the vehicle to drive that. At least have a phone call, if not actually a meeting. You want to be able to maintain a sense of balance and control, and I don't mean overbearing control, but healthy control in terms of classroom dynamics when you're conducting your class. And the same may be true, again, in healthcare agencies relative to new nurse orientee classes. So just be mindful of that. Breach of contract is more common, actually, relative to educational malpractice. It's just very hard, I think, to prove an educational malpractice harm. So if somebody was taught in a certain way in a classroom, and they unfortunately suffered some kind of emotional duress or claimed that they could not function properly relative to their academic performance, or the training associated with the type of job they might get, those could be grounds for educational malpractice. Very rare, though. So the breach of contract, breach of the standards set forth in the syllabus is much more common, seemingly still unusual, but easier to prove. Discrimination, that's another matter. That certainly can be contended, and especially for those students who may require special needs. That can be a big issue, in effect, then, too. So knowing the rights of individuals with special needs is huge. And just being conscious of one's own demeanor and the way in which you talk to your students, and especially for vulnerable populations and certain individuals, again, who are in the minority. I think those are important considerations that we should be mindful of, and sometimes we discriminate against others without realizing it, without knowing it. We're not particularly self-aware. Moving to Chapter 6, Teaching Role and Legal Implications. General kind of things. You're accountable relative to that contract, but also to organizing your courses and teaching in a prudent way, to be a consummate professional. So using strategies to liven and support active learning, to create and provide fair but clearly articulated assignments. I mean, those are important things. And it's certainly with assignment of grades. There's this notion of, again, what is fair. And this is difficult when you've got number grades or up and down on a continuum for individual assignments, let alone for a grade average for a whole course in an academic setting. Even in academia, the clinical evaluation, that pass-fail disposition is tough. So you could analogize that to your new orientees, or even with annuals. What is sufficient to demonstrate competency? What is measurable for those people that you have under you as an educator? So pass-fail can be tough in the clinical environment for sure. Have there been a standard of what are met competencies that support somebody being safe and effective? So that's important. All right, so grading often causes unrest, certainly in the academic world. So just be very clear. Behavioral objectives are written, so to speak, relative to the learner outcomes that we want. So things are objective and measurable. So be clear, be black and white, be concrete as much as possible. Keep it simple. And just be conscious then of overall course requirements and evaluation criteria to utilize those fairly and evenly. It's certainly difficult among some tensions with students and seemingly incivility. Another consideration, teaching in non-traditional environments. Here we talked a little bit about online teaching earlier. That whole notion about being able to be effective and to manage those processes effectively with still a high level of quality. It's tough. We covered this before, but no question about it. It takes time to develop the skills, as it will me, since I'm new to online teaching. The pedagogy and andragogy of learners. To try to take them in non-traditional or virtual environments is really challenging. So we'll take time to work on that and to get it to be a proficient process. And consider how you support in even non-traditional environments critical thinking, diagnostic reasoning. That's critical to nurse providers in terms of their training. Consider then engagement strategy. Here I am doing this videotape, but chat room use, which, by the way, I did look into that, and I think I already had stated, it just wasn't deemed by Matt Kyle, our instructional designer, as something that can be set up now to be a regular part of a pedagogy. In the future, I hope. Think about Twitter or social media, though, again, within reasonable boundaries as being information retrieval and dissemination modalities. In all, we need students, in fact, that are intrinsically motivated to stay engaged in the learning process, in the teaching learning process, I should say. So in all this, remember, as we say here for our program, netiquette, of course, at the top. Be mindful of the attendance, how often students are accessing websites. Be responsive, though, and as timely as possible. And I've struggled with that some. I beg your patience there, too. Thank you so much for your patience on that. Be as accessible as possible. I've tried to maintain that I am accessible by email, phone, as well. And that's worked for some of you when you've reached out. I appreciate people have reached out to me. Then too with special questions. So that's important within the learning environment. Clinical teaching, obviously we're clinicians first. So make sure you're orienting students through the clinical agencies well. Act as an advocate in the clinical environment. Give them the opportunity to make some mistakes. Respect their opinions. Listen to them clearly. And be as objective as you can in the evaluation process. Even if it is pass, fail, met or unmet. That's important. I appreciate then to those that went to the curriculum meetings and shared some of the insights, some of the discussion relative to clinical evaluation tool at Cedar Crest. That's important, and that links to this type of content. So, all right, very good. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I'll have another little video link for the other content coming up. Thanks again.